there's a lot of cool new music we're coming out right now.
Well, like with music, I feel like there's like you need to have someone like when I was younger, I was probably this guy for a lot of people where they could funnel and give you like the stuff, like not a DJ, but you need the cool guy friend who knows what's coming out.
You need some
As you,
curators.
yeah, you need like a curator, right? And as you get older, like you go so deeply into one thing to be like, okay, I'm going to be an expert in this. So here's my microscope. But in order to become an expert, you then start to give up some of your interesting aspects and other things because like all that time you used to do, like I used to spend like an hour or two looking for like a relatively unassuming artist that was deserving of praise. Now that goes into club fighters. So it's like
Right.
instead of looking at that, maybe I need to use my time much better where I like find like what I should probably do. I do this somewhat, but like the world doesn't appreciate albums anymore. So I put on songs,
I'm
but I
such an
should,
album guy, bro.
I like the albums too.
I'm such an album guy. Like there's a part of me too, like depending on the artist, it's like I feel like you haven't really experienced them if you don't listen to something sequentially as it was intended. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I like when I drive around, I listen to a lot of albums. Like I'll put on like, I think I listen to more classic albums, but I kind of think of like what's a rap album that's been pivotal. So like one was like I had never heard the full Cardi B album start to finish, and it feels like that's an album that's like important, especially for like women. Like that's like a record that record seemingly like kind of shaped a generation of like. And I was listening to it, and it's like this is probably a female version of 50 Cent. Like it's like when this comes on, it's like women had been wanting to hear a purely feminine, unembarrassing person. It's like I'm sexy, but I'm tough. And it's like that's she's like patient zero of that. Like everyone else had made compromises on it. But in terms of listening to that album, like I can't do it. It's not meant for me. But like I've been driving around, think like listening to music that people like I feel like impacts the world. So I can at least have an idea of why it impacted the world.
Well, dude, I'll just send you some fucking albums when I'm listening to them because that's like that was the for me music was like the first thing that I thought felt like that I was not an expert but like an expert in. You know what I'm saying? And boxing was not the side hustle, but it was like the other important thing in my life. And then as I've gotten older, that transition has become a little bit more 50-50 and maybe even more slanted towards boxing at this point, to be honest. But I still feel like it's just like ingrained in me to be aware of what's coming out and shit. You know what I mean? All right. So that was the informal intro. Welcome to episode 75 of the Slip and Wave podcast. I'm here with my good buddy, acclaimed author, ITR boxing extraordinaire, Lucas Ketelle, Big Dog Lukey. How you been, my guy?
I'm living. Talk to me, I talk back.
So it was funny that we were just talking about that. So when I finished your book, one of the first of all, let's show that thing real quick. You know what I'm saying? Just let people know.
You know, giveaway tonight. Giveaway tonight. Might have to change the time because someone wants to do another interview with me at the time the show is going to be on. So we might have to change that time. Might be moving back, might be moving forward. But I will be on the ITR stream later tonight. So,
not a,
talk to me, I talk back.
not a bad thing to be a man in demand. But so when I finished the book, one of the first comparisons I made in my mind was there's a book that maybe you even know. It's called Everything You Need to Know About the Music Business.
Never
And
heard of it.
so it's kind of like the music industry's version of what you're doing here in a sense where it's kind of breaking down some of the facets and some of the basics on how that industry is put together. Just I guess give like a brief summary or a gist on what this book is and what the objectives are and like what you're trying to communicate.
I mean, this is kind of like I was in the gym shooting Kevin Montano last night, and it's like anyone that knows me knows I'd much rather shoot a developing fighter who nobody's showing love to keep them in the gym and keep them chasing a dream. That gets me more motivated than going out and going to a media day or anything like, oh man, there's 50 media people. Here's elite athlete guy, and he's there. The point of this book, which is what everyone always asks me, they go, I heard you wrote a book. Is it doing good? And I'm like, yeah, it's selling surprisingly better than I thought. And people are like being nice. And I haven't got criticism yet. You know, I will get criticism because that's inevitable, right? Someone's going to go, well, who say something negative at some point, but kind of shocking that people haven't. But I think the major focus is boxing is a sport of use and abuse. It's overpromise and underdeliver, right? That's the theme of this book is a lot of times people overpromise and underdeliver. And because of that, I'd like to give people a roadmap in boxing. This isn't necessarily like the success formula, but these are things to like always be aware of. These are things to look at. An example, I compare amateur boxing to AAA baseball. If you're not having success as an amateur boxer, yes, you can turn pro, but what are you really doing it for? Are you doing it to walk out at a hotel ballroom in a local regional venue and have your song played? Because those guys that are beating you at the amateur shows, they're turning pro, and you're going to have to fight them again. And now it's going to be with smaller gloves, not shorter, smaller gloves. And it's actually going to be much harder fights. And I think that accountability is a big thing in this book. This is a book to hold a young person accountable for a lot of stuff in their lives.
Well, yeah, and I think it's as much about the structure of boxing and all of the different moving parts, but it's also a book about relationships ultimately. Like the key component or like the greatest currency in boxing is relationships. It's who's your cut man, who's your promoter, who's your manager, who are all of these people, and do they ultimately kind of have your best interest in mind?
Well, and I think that it's also like that's a great place of putting it, but it's also about just thinking about things that you might not think about, right? Because I'd say 90 to 95% of all boxing people who come into the sport of boxing who are pro boxers, each paycheck matters. So they're going to want to stretch each check. And the concept of getting $10,000, but half of it goes to my team and I have to pay taxes on it. And I'm actually making the lowest amount when it comes to looking at that big check that's 10,000. I might walk away with $3,000 knowing I saved some for taxes, knowing I took care of everyone. It's a radical idea because boxers often aren't thinking from the lens of I'm my own company, I'm my own business. When you're your own business, you're often, if you're the boss, you're getting paid the lowest salary until it's successful because part of your obligation is to fulfill the obligations that you bring people on to pay. That's part of being a leader. That's why I bring up people like Ernest Shackleton in this book, right? Ernest Shackleton's a very important person. I didn't bring up Lyndon B. Johnson, but LBJ in this office that I'm working from, I have a lot of the Caro books. He has 4 books on LBJ, and it's like, what is LBJ really about? LBJ is about how could he navigate a political system to get what he wanted. He was a Machiavellian president. He felt that it wasn't really about who he was. It was about clarifying the ends to the means that he wished to achieve as a president. So I say all that to say boxing is a lot like politics and it's a lot like Machiavelli's The Prince, where it's a lot of political lenience and power brokering. It's not as much a business. I don't think any business person would come into boxing and go, man, this is a well structured Fortune 500 company. It's about managing and dealing with relationships and leadership capacities.
That's that's really dense. That's really dense. It's a boxing as a business concept. If you came in and you looked at it, we've talked about the burning building getting looted a million times. It's like the only real comparison where there's shit to be had. Everyone's kind of screaming to get what they can get. You know what I'm saying? But if you can meet those people that are like calm in the fire and have the collective interest of you and your team, like that really is like the most important thing I think that I took out of it.
Good, like I mean, I wrote the book. It's been received well, but I never know how people are going to receive the book because when I reread the book, I get an interpretation each and every time different where like when I read the first page, it's like, okay, like because I put in one of my favorite quotes from Harry S. Truman where it says if you want a friend, buy a dog. And that's more
Yeah.
true than like in boxing. Like if you want a friend and you're coming into boxing to make a friend, you probably will make a friend, but it's better just to go to Petco or one of these pet stores and buy a dog because that's going to be a much better, healthier relationship. Boxing has been like for most of my life an abusive relationship, and now it's working towards being a healthy relationship. This is not the sport to find yourself as a person if you don't have the right people. It's a great thing that can build self confidence. It's a great thing, I think, to teach discipline. But if you enter it as a business and you haven't figured out some of these unanswered questions in your own life, it's just going to make everything more difficult because the level of poverty and the pay structure is rough. The only a select few get a substantial earnable living from this sport. And this book is kind of, in my opinion, the raw truth. Like, I'm not selling anybody a dream. This book is, I think, mainly written for 8 to 22-year-olds or parents of 8 to 22-year-olds or people in the boxing industry who want to say, that's kind of true. That's kind of true. They might chuckle and say, that's kind of true. Or it's for a fighter burnt out midway through his career to maybe give them hope. I'm looking at this book as kind of like boxing's Machiavelli's The Prince. And it's kind of funny because that's my favorite book. So it's kind of funny that the first thing I ever published and wrote, um, there are a lot of comparisons, right? It's kind of written like a treatise. And The Prince has a guy who's a prince on the cover. Mine has me in a boxing ring. There's a lot of comparisons unintentionally. So, and I think a big thing to point out too is it's not this different about what I wrote is every chapter ends with questions. I'm
Yep.
not
I
trying to
love
talk
that
your
part.
ear off.
I love
I
that
want
part.
the reader to think. I don't want you just to take my word and go with it. I want you to think about these scenarios. And let's not forget there's a lot of people that aren't very good readers. So if you can't read like and I made it double spaced, bigger font, so then I didn't want to
Right.
intimidate anyone.
Well, it's like
If it was
here's the
too
information, and then here's some of the things that you're hoping that they reflect on.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, do you know how many people have told me they just jump and read the questions and then they like the questions, so they go back and read a chapter, and before they know it, they read the whole book because they started at the questions and then worked their way back to reading, and then they go piece by piece jumping around, and then all of a sudden they're like, I read the book. And
Yeah.
it's like that was the purpose of the questions was I want this to be very accessible to people. I don't want it to be something that's like you have to know a slew of words and all types of things. I don't want to say I dumbed it down, but we went from 200 pages down to 117 pages. That wasn't it hurt my ego. It hurt my ego because I wanted a big fat book, but my girlfriend said, "Are we trying to make the best, most readable thing that's going to impact lives, or do you want to feel good and stick your chest out and say I'm a big author who wrote a 200-page book?"
Hit some
And I
stats.
had to tuck my pride.
Yeah. So, I mean, having known you for a while and we're on podcasts every week and we talk and whatever, I think it's important to ask this because I think it helps kind of it ups the value on what you're providing here because there's a lot of good shit in here. How would you describe if somebody didn't know you or hadn't met you, how would you describe your role or your position in boxing and how you've come to all of this?
I really don't know how to answer that because like okay, I started out which I'm writing in my second book outside of the ropes, right? So I'll start out with what and so I started out I went to school to make videos like '08 the financial situation happens and there's no jobs. There's no creative jobs. Social media isn't really a thing, so you can't get a job for a company making those. it literally looked like the Great Depression probably looked, where there were literally signs when I was going places that said no help wanted. You know, you see help wanted. I literally was going places where it said no help needed. And I remember I went to 20 job interviews, and it could speak to me, but I got declined at each and every one. And I was going to like ones from my college degree. Then I'd go to like Abercrombie and Fitch to sell clothes. Oh, we don't really like the way. I just kept getting rejected. So at that time, I started getting back into boxing because it's like, okay, I'm broke. I think I had like maybe $2,000 in my savings, and I was making a little bit of money on the side, just through like kind of projects and this and that, that I could pay my rent and do that. But it wasn't like my money was going up in any capacity. So I got back around boxing, and then I was going to be like a school counselor. So I'm like, okay, if I go back to school and everyone's broke, that's probably like a good investment. So I'm like, I'll be a school counselor. So working with some people. And then the epiphany moment was, it was a weekend, and I was going to the bars, and I was kind of really unfocused. I kind of cheated myself out of being an athlete when I was young because I didn't really have a focus on anything. So I never got to see how far I could push myself athletically, which is kind of a bummer, but it's something I have to just deal with because, like, in many ways, I have to sit here and smile and just be like, you did it. Like, you chose not to do that. Smile, be proud of that. Like, you never did it. You need to be so grateful you didn't do it because that's what you chose to do. And I really need to embrace that, right? Because I wasn't accountable enough to handle that. I didn't get to where I needed to, and I'm firmly believe I never am not accountable. So I watched Bernard Hopkins versus Chad Dawson, and I paid for it on pay-per-view. And the result was like Chad hit him with a spine buster, and B Hop kind of got the fight stopped, and it was weird. So I wrote a blog post for like some blog thing at the time. I don't even know what it was. And I shared it with like four buddies, and they were like, you could be a boxing writer. And I was like, okay, so how do you do that? Because nothing else is working. Like, I literally was doing everything, and it's like I never heard positive reinforcement. It's like I was making videos. It's like, yeah, that's kind of cool, whatever. So it's like I do this boxing thing, and I heard like three positive things. And it's like I'm going on from like 2001 to like 2010. Like, it's like a 20-to-1 ratio of negative to positive. So it's like, this is positive. Okay, let's go in that direction. So then I just started trying to figure out, okay, make a Twitter account, make this, make that, keep up with the fights. And then what I liked was, instead of going to the bars or doing dumb stuff, I was like sitting at home to watch a fight. So I had to learn a skill. Through that, went to some fights. Then I started following Don Chargent, Paco Damian cards in Northern California region, befriended some fighters like Andy Venesis and all of them. And when you're a regional writer and cover the sport, you befriend fighters. So then it becomes kind of like an oil executive, right? You don't work in the government, but you probably have deep relationships with politicians where the roles become confusing and the lines blur, because it's like I'm covering Andy, but at the same time I've seen him for 5 years. And then when he moves on to Top Rank, or Gabriel Flores moves on to Top Rank, and I was covering him when he was 15, you're not going to be objective because you have so much human interest brought into him. You care that deeply about him. So my role in boxing originally was just someone that was observing the sport. But I think what makes me interesting is because I never had a major backing, when I never had someone say, oh, this guy's dope, be sure to read his stuff. I had to really get it out the mud, and I had to go through all these different channels and learn firsthand through an apprenticeship on the road and with the fighters. And I think because of that, my perspective is a lot different. And because of that, I feel like my perspective is more so of a fighter and a coach, more so than a media personality, because I wasn't really embraced by the media. Like, no one really was like, okay, let me show you how to be a media guy. And honestly, like, a lot of the media people, I just didn't really like the way they talked. Like, I didn't relate to the perspectives they had. Like, I don't want to sit up here and tell you that boxing's terrible, Because that's like going to a restaurant and telling you that the food here is great except for the chicken tenders. Like who wants to eat at a restaurant where you're disparaging the food at the restaurant? So that's basically like, does that sum it up?
Yeah, bro. I mean, that was great. Why do you I was thinking about this, right? Like boxing's been around forever, man. Why do you think there's never been something done like this before, where there's really somebody that's like explaining how all of this shit works?
I mean, I'm sure someone did something before me. It's just that it either never caught on or it was never marketed or it was marketed and caught on and then at a certain point it died off. But I'm sure someone did this, but I think the main reason is people that would write a book like this get so burnt out by the sport of boxing itself that by the time they're about to write something like this, they'd rather just leave boxing altogether because they feel hurt and abandoned. So I think the real reason is most people that would take time to write a book like this would rather just leave the sport than sit down and give more to the sport.
I guess what's still motivating for you when
The
it,
young fighters, like the young, seeing young people. I mean, I was telling this to Kevin Montano when I shot his video that's going to be up probably around the time this video goes up on ITR is the main event fights aren't really interesting to me. Like the fights itself aren't interesting. I think like the more I get into boxing, it's like looking at the characters, looking at the journeys of people. Like a guy like Vasil Lomachenko is interesting to me, but his boxing skills are probably the most uninteresting thing about him. You have someone who has this fantastical record, this amazing record, who has this deep relationship with his father, who moved away from his country, who lives in a foreign place, and he's mostly about legacy. Sure, he's been paid well, but it's like most of the Lomachenko thing is he wants to go down as an all-time great. Everything's legacy, legacy, legacy. He gave up some of his purse. Seeing a young fighter like Kevin Montano, Charlie Sheehy, Lorenzo Powell, Kane Sandoval, and seeing them in their infancy going to the gym. Maybe that's a special day for them to see me go to the gym, to break up the monotony of their young life, to go and film, to give them some clips that they can be proud of. That's what keeps me going. But going to a major fight to see two millionaires fight and to actually get excited about the outcome, that rarely happens anymore. Like that type of stuff is not what I'm in this sport for. I'm in the sport to see the development of young people and to see how far they can go in the sport. I rarely look at a matchup and go, man, I can't wait to see this fight. Like more often than not, I'll watch the undercard and turn off the main card. You know, I want to see how the young fighters are doing, and then I'll look at the matchups. But what's great is I don't have to watch these main event fights all the time because you kind of can know the outcomes of some fights. I won't spell it out, and I can watch YouTube videos that are 4 to 5 minutes that just give me the highlights. And if I knew the outcome and people aren't texting my phone because everyone texts, I'm boxing guy, right? So all my friends are boxing people. So if nobody's texting my phone saying, hey, turn the fight on, and I have other things to do, like last week and then the week before, I had stuff to do. I go out and do stuff, you know, but I always make sure I see the young fighters. I always try to support my community and I always circle back to see the fights. But I'm the first one to tell you that I don't have some deep passion to watch boxing consistently night in, night out.
I guess one of the other things that you brought up in the book too is that like amateur boxing is the real sport and the professional.
But it's just as corrupt. Like it's just as corrupt. Like let's not act like the head of the IOC didn't get caught for drug dealing. But keep going with your question.
Well, I guess what I was going to ask is there a world or is there any kind of way where the structure that keeps amateur boxing a sport can that at all be implemented in professional boxing?
So here's the problem is like The fighters, like the Pro Box TV is doing amateur boxing right now. They have the last chance tournament, last chance dance or whatever they're called, last chance event where guys are fighting Joseph Fernandez, Kendo Tremendo, Michael Dutchover was in it. Guys that sign up for those type of things are either going to be well-paid world champions looking for greatness, or guys who've taken a couple of losses who have their backs against the wall. You're not going to find the middle tier of prospects looking to enter a tournament because they're all smart enough to know in this era a loss devalues you so much. You could go from making 100,000 to 20,000 just off of one loss. And because of that, no one wants to get paid less. So what we have, because a loss hurts your career financially so much, we have people navigating these systems as best as they can. And what does it do as fight fans? Well, it helps the fighters and all of that. But in terms of a sport, it makes for a few fights where you can just kind of pick and choose what fights on the card you want to see because people are just getting their yearly income and then they're waiting until they have enough financial stability or they're forced into a fight to put forth the fight that the fans want to see.
So it's, I mean, essentially, it's just the the way the money is broken down and the way the structure is broken down. There is no way to enforce something the same way you would in amateur boxing,
Well, I
essentially.
mean, I think the thing is, like in amateur boxing, the boxers are rather helpless. They can't advocate for themselves all that much. And I say that to say, yes, USA Boxing does a great job at hearing out the fighters, and I'm sure in the world level they do. But you have to adhere to certain guidelines, and if you don't adhere to the guidelines, you're done. You can't do it. On a local level in amateur boxing, a guy misses weight, a couple of counties over, none of the local promoters will stick together. They'll put that kid on the show. So that's the total anarchy of that, right? So it's like you can see in amateur boxing at the highest level, people there's some guidelines. At the lowest level, how can we get these as many people on that'll bring people, that'll pay money, that'll drive up revenue for whatever the heck we're trying to do, right? So in pro boxing, beyond that, it's opportunity granters. So you have to find someone that'll grant you an opportunity. And now, whoever that person that grants you an opportunity has to paint their own version of a Picasso. So they're taking your career in their hands, and then whatever they envision as a ideal or a successful career, it's really going to be the manager, the promoter's idea of how to mold you into a finished product. And oftentimes that isn't, hey, let's just see how good this person is compared to these other, because it's, as I said before, oftentimes the fights you want to see, it's four equally powerful brokers of this leverage in the sport. And if it's four powerful people, why would one of them want to give up their power because said asset would now weaken their ability to have power? And this is a sport of power brokering and having power and leveraging power into money. So the issue is it's not just the fighters, it's also the distribution of the power in the system where we devalue the fighter so much based on a loss that the whole entity that makes money around them does not want to put them in those fights unless they truly believe their fighter will win every fight.
But there's a part of me though that I feel like to some extent, and I mean we've talked about this, but to some extent, the preserving the O element of boxing is a little bit overrated. Like
It's terrible.
if I
It's
look at a
terrible. Like
guy like
Chico Corrales versus Castillo. How many losses did Chico have going into that fight? Like four or five? And it's like
a
if that,
couple,
yeah, but I mean he had some losses. And it's like if Jose Luis Castillo fought Chico Corrales today, which is one of my favorite fights. That's one of the best fights I've ever seen. You know how many people would talk about how terrible of a fight that is? Oh my God, this guy's washed up. I'm gonna miss this fight. And do you know how many fighters in Chico's position would view themselves as a journeyman pro and would lose the intestinal fortitude to push the same way? We're not just devaluing the sport by that, we're also turning boxers into products
But
who
I think,
have
but the flip side of that too is I think there's guys like Lomachenko and like Robesi Ramirez and Elvis Rodriguez, and maybe that's just that they're really exceptional fighters. But I do feel like if you have that mindset, there is a path to coming back from that, and it's treated like you died or something. You know what I mean?
and that's what's wrong is like I grew up on like a lot of guys would lose and we didn't give up on him. Like one of my favorite fighters is Kelly Pavlik. He lost fights and I was watching Kelly fight all the way up until the end because it to me, and now I'm probably dating myself, but to me, boxing is about the emotional moments a fighter has with me on Saturday and Friday nights and how those correspond to my own life. So when my grandfather passed away, I knew the fights that were right around there because my grandfather passed away and my grandfather was boxing and he's never coming back. And it's like all these unanswered questions. I'll always remember certain things around boxing milestones when I got into boxing. And if a like example, Chris Algieri versus Ruslan Provodnikov, I started watching that fight not expecting a good fight. What I saw was a movie as good as The Godfather. I saw I saw drama, a little bit of comedy, unintentional comedy, action, suspense. A terrible. The comedy was the scorecards. I think it was Steve Weisfeld having Ruslan up like 117, 110. Andre Ward so kindly saying, I don't know about that one. But, he just took, he goes, I don't know if that's the score, Steve. But, Steve, on that one, no, that was a perfect moment like of boxing, right? You have this guy, they're like, oh, steam judge, completely whiffs on the card. No, no, like how did you get the thing or anything? They just take him off TV. They're like, oh God, this guy missed on the card. Let's send him back to judging. So then he can give those in real time for the outcome, not on television. Um, it's it's definitely a sport where like the emotional connection between watching a fighter runs parallel to the journey you're on to be the best the version of yourself. And what I think's hurting boxing right now is we're not having enough Andre Wards and Tim Bradleys. Those fighters meant a lot to me because when they really stepped up, they had a lot of really courageous moments that I felt like mirrored when someone's member is battling an illness, when someone's trying to get a promotion in a job and feels overlooked. Those fighters fought for everything that they had and they walked away the victor. And I think that a lot of us don't relate to someone who has a really awesome path where it's like, okay, you are the one. You are the chosen one. Let's bring you along until the most opportune time to fight someone for a large sum of money. And guess what? If someone doesn't like it, let's just talk about how much money you make. Even though they make none of your money, let's just justify it with the money you make. Even though the fans don't like Dakota, why do we care about pay-per-view buys? Like, why is that a thing with the media? We don't profit off of pay-per-view buys. It does us utterly no sense. You and me buy pay-per-views to watch the fight, but once I've consumed the fight, I couldn't care less if it's just you and me that bought it. We tune in to watch the fights. Maybe if you live near Dakota or me, you care about a local show, how many they sell, because maybe they'll come back. But I've never understood this obsession with things that don't relate to us, right? Why do we care about the live gate? And I think it comes down to the fact that this is what we've been taught to care about. We've been taught to care about the things that benefit the promoters and not the fighters. We've been taught to hate each other and be divided rather than talk about the fact that we all love boxing, that we're all like-minded people, you know?
Well, and I think also too, I on some level, I think people are interested in the pay-per-view buys because it's like they're trying to justify what they just paid, like the price they just paid. But I totally get what you're saying, where it's like this obsession over the economic part, where in a sense it's like I almost like don't want to fucking know any of it as
I
a
mean, it's like, that's like if you and me, like you like McDonald's, I like Burger King. and we sit down and go, well, this is this month's profit margin for this one. Shouldn't the conversation begin and end at the price point for the consumer? And if you like the taste, like that, to me as a consumer, it's like whatever burger place I'm going to, do I like the food? Is the price fair? I don't need to know about their profit share earnings. Are they up this quarter? Is the company moving forward? Who's going to be doing the this and that? Is this We're too obsessed with wealth that's not our own wealth. It's an illusion to make us feel like if we align ourselves with this, now we're a successful entity. It's like an illusion that we're a part of the American dream when we're just a consumer.
What is there any advice or anything that you could give to a young fighter who's not particularly outspoken or social media inclined, but they're really talented?
I think the big thing is do every interview. If anyone ever asks you, all young fighters should do every single interview, from small interviews to little interviews to big interviews to tall interviews to stout interviews to non-existent interviews. Do fake interviews with your friends. Get used to doing that. And I think the other thing is, how many fighters do we see that are being everything but themselves? And I think that if you're not being who you are, people where I'm from call it the roly poly. You'll roll over. We want to see authenticity. I think that that's been my success in boxing. Is I might say dumb stuff or this or that, but I think everyone always knows I'm sincere. And when I speak words, I'm speaking words that I feel. And I think that sincerity always leaps out the page, because we got from writers to fighters, a lot of people saying things, looking at trying to read the room and say things that they think the room wants to hear. And I think for any young fighter, you don't have to do any of this stuff. I think the big thing you have to do is be who you truly are, unless who you are is a serial killer or a bad person. Then you might have to go inward and figure out what ways to function in society, starting off with morality and being around good people, which I do think there is an element of every now and then I'm around a boxer and I go, this guy might have been a serial killer if he didn't find boxing. Like, people underestimate the mindset of some people that come into the sport, I think, truly. Um, I think that the big thing I'd tell a youngster is just be who you are. If you're not an Instagram guy, don't be an Instagram guy. If you're not a Facebook guy, don't be a Facebook guy. There's going to be things in your personality that you'd be drawn to. Just don't look at Errol Spence and go, oh, he's got strap season. I got to come up with my catchphrase. Not everybody gets a catchphrase. And guess what? Most catchphrases are earned, not given, and that's a big thing. The worst thing you can be is a fighter that gave himself his own nickname. Who are you? What's your nickname? The KO King. Who gave it to you? Well, that's me, KO King. But
Just feel like my mom gave me that nickname.
yeah, they call me cute guy. Who gave it to your mom?
They call me nice young man.
Yeah, and that's the type of world we're in. Like, we got fighters who, they're not dumb. They want to build up a marketing profile. They're like a Fortune 500 company. This is my logo. This is my following. This is my nickname. This is how I train. This is this. This is that. Because they want to get people invested so they can get a return. But don't go too far away from you. Don't get too far from who you are as a person. Because I think that we have so much bull crap in this world. It's very easy for and when I say a young person, I'm saying anyone from the age of 8 to 30 years old. Because I think until you're about 28 or 30, you don't really know who you are. You have to fail before you succeed. It's very rare that someone under the age of 28 is a very successful person. You have to have some failures to know where to go and where to. Some people can do it, but I think that that's also a situational, that structure. There's also some timing that plays into that, and there's also God-given talent. Some people find what they're supposed to do and they get it off the rip.
I definitely, when I was reading this, man, the whole time I was thinking, I was like, damn, I wish this existed when I was a teenager, when I was you know what I mean, when I was younger, because it was just like, there's so many things, just even common sense, that as a kid you don't know that that's not normal. Like when people spar without mouthpieces, or like I'm in this gym and I have one aspiration in my mind, but there's no one in here with a fight scheduled, or all these other different things that I personally went through that I'm sure a lot of young people went through, just to have something like this that provided some level of a compass of, it's not just finding any old gym. It's not necessarily a guy in a garage. It's like, if this is something you want to do, you have to find somewhere where people are being serious. Any thoughts on fucking Eubank and Ben this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I really like Connor Ben in this fight, and I feel like I'm the minority in that. I just feel like Eubank is having all the red flags of the camp from hell. I get that he's smaller, but it's like eating fried chicken at public events, not seeming to take the fight serious. Trains with Roy Jones Jr. Roy's not in his corner. His father might not be in the corner. His father wanted to pull him out of the fight. It sounds like this screams like red flag after red flag. Yeah,
I
everyone's like,
was
ah,
under
he's
the
the
impression it was canceled and then it was being advertised on this card the other day.
yeah. So I mean, this screams like the camp from hell. Like it just screams anyone that knows what's going on. It has very big concerns for him. I just think that this is going to be a fight where Connor Ben kind of becomes like a local legend in the UK from this win. And then he gets absolutely annihilated by like the world class top five guys, whether he's at 154 or 147. I think he's 2 to 3 years away from competing with the very, very best guys. Like I think Jermel Charlo's just a different gear. I think Boots, Virgil Ortiz, Sean Porter, or not Sean Porter, Errol Spence Jr., Terrence Cross. I think they're just a different gear. I think Stanionis is a different gear. Conwell's a different gear. So he's going to put himself in a spot with a win here where he's a big marquee name, but there's a big butt there, right? And it's like, it's not a big butt like the people I follow on Instagram, the girls I follow. The big butt is he's gonna with this big power now he's not gonna want to go down. He's not gonna want to face those developmental fights. And for all my UK friends, they keep telling me this is kind of like what Eddie Hearn will do. How can we get a fighter the most money at or near a weight class? Not necessarily valuing the weight classes, valuing where's the biggest financial opportunity. And I think Ben's going to win, but I think this is going to permanently derail kind of his chance for a Hall of Fame bid. I think that this is going to mark his descent downward, even though I favor him to win.
Why do you see it as a descent downward? Just because he's going to have to, it's going to be a high that he's going to come down from, and then he's actually going to, is that basically what you're saying?
Well, twofold. If he goes to welterweight, he's going to yo-yo in weight, and he's probably going to win this fight, he's going to have to put on some muscle, and now he's not going to be the same physical frame to get back down in weight. So that's going to be an issue. Secondly, he's going to take punishment from Eubank. Eubank is not going to just patty cake him. He's going to land on him. And even if he wins the fight, which I don't see him stopping Eubank because Eubank's not a guy that gets stopped. I don't see that. He's going to be in a fight where he accumulates damage. And this could be a rematch. This could be a very close fight, right? Because he's much smaller. So let's say he has 2 fights with Eubank. He's going to take a lot of damage. And now he's going to go into a fight against a world level fighter, we'll say at 154. Damage from a bigger man after kind of jumping from facing older champions. He fought older guys that are very good fighters, Chris Van Heerden, Chris Algieri, at the end of their careers. Older guys. Into Eubank, moving up in weight. From that win to get paid the same, he has to fight a top 8 world rated guy, 154. Even if it's a UK guy, that's going to be a huge jump. And then if he accumulates damage from a bigger man, I just think you're playing with fire and you're going to shorten the career unless Connor Ben is a truly exceptional fighter. And I have great concerns. I had great concerns with him at welterweight. I think a guy like Rashidi Ellis would be a hard fight for him. I think Jamal James would be a hard fight for him. I think there's a lot of fights when you look through the top 15 of the division. There's more hard fights than there are, oh, that's a good one. And I think it also speaks to when they were developing him, they weren't bringing in the top 15 fighters. They were bringing in notable fighters at the end of their career. When you fight a guy like this and you're on pay-per-view, it's hard to get off a pay-per-view because the money's good and you don't want to fall back. So that's what I mean.
Do you see a world at all where Eubank is just like a little bit too big and it's a Golovkin Kell Brook kind of situation?
Easily, easily. Because I see a world where he comes out and he pumps a jab and he rocks him. Like, do you get what I'm saying? Like, I see a world where he's physically manhandling him. And if that happens, that's just going to be his career. Because like if he takes a beating from a bigger man, we're looking at Conor Benn, who's not a defensive wizard. He's a physically durable pressure guy. If he gives up some of his durability, like we're looking at a guy who it's going to be hard.
Well, and I guess that has to be their hope, right? Is that Eubank cutting down to 157 has taken some level of explosiveness out of him to where that's not necessarily how he's trying to get down that night, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fun fight that's going to make a ton of money because both of their fathers were in great fights, and it's a great selling point. Like from a business standpoint, it's like here's the sons fighting, and another selling point is they're meeting at these unknown weights. There's unknowns for both guys. One guy's going up, one guy's coming down. What's going to happen? They're meeting in the middle. What's going to happen? So I think that from a entertainment aspect, it's very entertaining because we love unanswered questions. We love when we tune in, what are we going to see? The problem is it's probably going to hurt both of these guys' careers because they're doing stuff to their body that they don't want to do.
Yeah, there is a part of it that I guess I'm not concerned that it's more trouble than it's worth because I think it's worth making the matchup. I just wonder if the terms are like at a certain point, it's just like if you're gonna fight at 157, just fight at middleweight. Just fight at 160. It's less of a radical cut for Eubank.
But Dakota, who would that favor?
Eubank.
Yeah. And who's this fight supposed to favor?
Well, I don't really know. I haven't seen any media about it or anything. I don't know.
157, in my opinion, means it's supposed to favor Ben. Because if they're not fighting at middleweight, why would they not fight at middleweight? Well, the reason they probably aren't fighting at middleweight is Ben doesn't want to fight Eubank at middleweight. So they wanted a concession to meet at some weird catch weight, thinking that mentally, that because we know both, it's that last pound and a half that really gets on you. Eubank can probably get to 159, but when I see a 57, that's a strategic decision saying, how far can you push your will at this point? How far can you get that weight off? Because we know Eubank is going to grind to get to 57. And Ben is hoping that that's going to deplete him to some point. If they made it at 60, it would be a real weight class. But by seeing there's a catch weight, it tells me people on Ben's side want a bit of an advantage. They know that they're possibly the A side fighter, which I believe they are, and they want to potentially weaken a bigger man with a notable name. So they want to get him to 57.
Why do you think that Ben is the A side? I think I agree with what you're saying, but why do you think that is? Because Eubank, the truth is, he's been around for like a decade. He's been in with some top guys. He has more notable wins against James DeGale, other guys at higher weights. Why do you think it is that
He's an undefeated guy who I feel like is kind of surging at the moment. Matchroom is really kind of struggling to find that next fighter. So if you look at their stable, they've had Joshua, they've had Katie Taylor. To me, Lee Wood is a guy like that could be a star for them, but they don't really value Lee Wood in a weird way. Chantel Cameron feels like she could be kind of a star, especially if they put her in with Katie Taylor. For some reason, they're not letting her fight all that often, which is another kind of head scratcher where it's like Lee Wood, Chantel Cameron, winning, exciting fighters. Why are you doing it? Conor Benn, to me, they have expectations of this guy's going to fill arenas and potentially take one of those Anthony Joshua dates when Joshua starts to not fight as often. And I view Conor Benn as this is part of our plan moving forward into this next decade is he's going to be an arena filler. He looks the part of a fighter. He has the history behind him, and he can possibly fill up big venues if he gets these type of wins. So I think that Ben is the A side because I think that from a standpoint of a business and from a fan standpoint, I think there's more excitement about his future in the sport.
Well, and I think that at one time that was Eubank. I don't know if that time has come and gone just because of age or because enough time has gone
It's the
on.
losses, bro. It's like Eubank went into these fights like he lost to one of the
Those are
Smith
Billy Joe Saunders.
brothers,
Billy Joe Saunders.
Billy Joe Saunders, one of the Smith brothers. I believe what was the World Series of boxing Super Series, the one that he lost? Was that a Smith brother that beat him, or was it George Groves that beat him?
It was George
What
Groves.
George Groves beat him. So it's like he's had these fights where it's like if you're gonna be the guy, Billy Joe Saunders, good fighter, but I don't think people looked at Billy Joe and go, "This is gonna be a guy that fights Canelo." Billy Joe earned that spot by basically taking Eubank's spot. George Groves kind of lost his spot when he lost to Carl Froch and lost to Badu Jack. He regained his position in the sport by beating Eubank Jr., who had all this excitement. Eubank Jr. has often been a guy we've had expectation for, but he hasn't fulfilled those expectations.
Well, and like you said, in the big fight, right, which you say in your book, that could be a fight that is really not even that big a deal. But in his instance of the big fights, he hasn't delivered, and so at this point now he's kind of getting like a third chance, fourth chance, or whatever at the big fight. And can
And
you?
then one of his big fights is Matt Koroboff, right? And Matt Koroboff got injured. He
Such
was
a good
beating
fighter,
Eubank.
such a good fighter.
But you get what I'm saying? It's like it seems to me if we look at the pattern, Connor and Ben has had one or two big fights for him by his standards. Algieri, Van Heerden, both solid fights. He has one sketchy fight developing. All fighters have a sketchy fight in developmental circuits. Don't judge it. Patterns we judge. One outlier, that could be something weird. Eubank doesn't typically win these type of fights. So the question is, can Eubank change something about himself? Or is that the pattern? What scares me is the change he's making seems like instability. It seems like more chaos rather than more
But
structure.
don't you think that eating the fried chicken is a little bit like Mayweather eating McDonald's on 24/7? Like, you know what I mean? Isn't that
I
like a
think it's a
fight?
direct influence. I think that he grew up watching Floyd, and I think it's literally his version of it.
So that's what I'm saying. Isn't that more of just like he's not sweating it as opposed to like, wow, he's really making poor dietary choices this camp. You get what I'm saying? Like,
I get what you're saying, but like I also feel like you have to that like it's like when Joseph Adorno ate a Philly cheesesteak on his Instagram live and then he missed weight. It's like you don't want to play with fire that much because we have concerns about can you make the weight? And you're basically like mocking people saying like of course I'm going to make the weight and we have real concerns about how you're going to make the weight. So it's like you have to be extremely confident you can hit that number and I don't think he's ever hit that number and I think the lowest in his career was something like 2011 or 2012. It's like he's been like 10 years at a much higher weight and he's that presentation to me is like you're playing with the boxing gods. Boxing is a very cruel sport, and you don't want to be like, oh, look at me, man. I'm eating junk food, but don't worry, I'm training my balls off. So I'm going to be on. And it's like, if he comes in at 158.5 and the fight's in jeopardy, people are going to go back and look at that type of stuff. Floyd ate McDonald's, but he never came in at heavy.
except against Marquez, which was a catchweight fight.
Yeah, that's true.
Random piece of trivia that I happen to know, but he did come in 2 pounds over and just paid a fine. Who do you think is the best welterweight that Conor Ben can beat or hang with? Like, is he at a point where we can confidently say he can compete with Kavaliauskas and David Avanesian and maybe even like Keith Thurman, or is he not even there yet?
I mean, I think that him versus Cody Crowley and Abel Ramos and Mario Barros, those are fights. I think him versus Mike Fox or Mean Machine, that's a fight. Michael McKinson, that's a fight. Um, Ivan Guleb is rated highly. That's a fight. Giovanni Santillan, he's in that kind of the tier. I think he wants to be like an A-lister with Thurman and all those guys, but he's just not in that tier. And the problem is, I think that if you match him with the tier that might be a little lower based on accolades and based on where they fit into that ladder in the ranking scale, those are 50-50 fights. Those aren't just like, oh man, he goes in there and does it. Because what bothers me about Ben is he wants to be compared to Virgil Ortiz and Boots Ennis. They're putting together spectacular performances against world title challengers from recent memory. Ben has not been in with a guy who's fought for a belt within the last 2 to 3 years. So just come up with a name of a guy who fought for a welterweight belt in the last 2 to 3 years. So like we got, I guess we could throw Avanesian in there. We could throw Mean Machine. We could throw who else? Errol Spence, Ugas, right? We could throw one of these guys.
Somebody like Jamal James.
That's like what I was saying. So how comfortable do you feel saying, okay, Ben's gonna win that?
I think I don't know enough. That's ultimately the reality, right? We haven't seen him in with somebody of that level, and that's kind of the logical next step. And this fight is, like you said, a complete diversion from anything that's sort of me him just moving up welterweight.
It's capitalism, right? It's like
Yeah.
this is a way to make a ton of money. And it's kind of like it's either going to really work out for you and you're going to be on your way to Joshua, and a bunch of people are going to be like, look at this badass. He moved up in weight.
And look, he's a good fighter, bro. And he's like 25 years old. He's a young guy. You know what I'm saying? He does get better basically every time he's on TV. So I do think that there is a lot of upside to him.
That being said, it's a big step up. Like, this is a big step up in weight. This is a big step up in terms of what he's trying to do. And like, I guess what I don't like is this is a strictly for money kind of fight where it's like I know the UK public are going to buy this fight and they're excited about this fight. But what kind of bothers me personally is if something goes wrong with Ben, he's a guy that potentially could carry the sport in the UK. I don't think Eubank is in that position anymore to carry the sport. I think he can assist with the sport, but I don't see him putting the sport of boxing on his back in the UK.
No.
Ben potentially could. And what we've learned from a lot of our fighters is Kell Brook, Roy Jones, when you play with these, even Canelo, when you play with these weight classes and move around, all of a sudden the performance variables change greatly.
Yep.
And to me, what's dangerous, this is strictly my opinion. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It's an opinion is I think the powers that be see Chris Eubank as a very vulnerable guy with a famous name, and they think that this is a very winnable fight for Conor Benn.
Well, I mean, I think it's a better matchup than that, but again, it's like a lot of fights recently where this is just like a really good matchup, and then to put another paywall behind it, like it's really frustrating. Because
Yeah.
I don't think it's a fight that warrants that, but I think it's a really good fight that I would love to watch. And now you're gonna make me make tough decisions.
Yeah, I mean, and I think putting it behind a paywall, whether it's America or the UK, that's always a tough one too. Paywall, paywall, paywall.
I don't know, man. Is there? So I was trying to find this before, but is there anywhere to watch Fundora and El Campo?
Showtime. So
It's
that's
on
a
Showtime.
Showtime championship boxing card. And
So weird because on
I
ESPN it literally doesn't say a network.
I mean, we need. I was saying this on Twitter. We need a American fight schedule coming out soon, or else our fourth quarter is just going to be very bare bones. It's going to be very bare bones.
It's bare bones as fuck right now. We're already basically everything that's getting talked about is for the early part of next year, whether it's Charlo and um, Tim Zoo. There's all kinds of fights where, and I'm already thinking that Spence and Crawford. I'm expecting February at this point.
I mean, it's just it feels like last year had a great fourth quarter, and I'm optimistic about that. This Showtime card with Fandora, it's a pretty solid card. I really like that there's a Mike Fox versus Mean Machine Aegis Kavakalkis fight,
That's a great fight.
but I think it's on YouTube, which is also pretty good for the hardcore pugilist enthusiasts like you and me because we don't if you don't have Showtime, you can watch it on there. I believe that. Don't quote me on that. Fun card, right? We got Jerwin and Kanajas fighting. I think Fernando Martinez is the guy's name who beat him previously. That's a nice fight.
Yeah.
We got Carlos Adames versus Montiel. We got Fandora, but to me, it really looks like okay, Adames could be a guy, right? He could be a guy that contends against Charlo. Fernando Martinez, probably contractual rematch. Let's throw it, fun fight. And then after
Isn't it
that,
Montiel?
well, Montiel's fighting Adames. I think Fernando Martinez is fighting Jerwin and Kanajas on the opener.
I gotcha.
And then Fandora is taking on Ocampo, who's won some good regional wins on the regional circuit. But this to me kind of feels like, can Fandora be an underestimated guy? Can this be a guy who we look back in 5 years and he's main eventing cards, a multi-division world champion, and this is the start of a Fandora thing? Because the thing that I think people underestimate with Fandora is not just is he talented, not just is he talented, he has something about him that not many fighters have. Joe Joyce has this, a few other guys have it, where there's Wilder has this too. There's one selling point that'll get people interested off of the jump. Have you seen that really tall guy that fights at a lower weight class? Have you seen that 6'6" guy that's 154 pounds? That will sell to people. Just seeing that person and how skinny he is, that will sell. So I think the fact that him and his sister Gabriella are going to be fighting on this card together, this really feels like if all things work together, this is going to be a homecoming, and Samson, as well as the other promoters, testing the waters for Fandora's star power as he ramps up to a potential Charlo fight, or what I think is coming, an Errol Spence Jr. fight in the near future. Fandora versus Errol Spence, which I think is going to be a bigger fight than people might anticipate.
I mean, I would love to see him in Spence. I ultimately see him as a guy moving up multiple weight classes. And I think that in a lot of ways, he's not really getting enough attention for what he's doing. I mean, there's a lot of guys. I'm trying to think of comparisons, but like somebody like Jaime Munguia, I don't think has a win on the level of uh Fondora's win over Erickson Lubin. So but I think it's also because he's so tall and he fights on the inside, and there's some technical deficiencies. But I feel like the way he's moving, he's moving in a different kind of way than a lot of these guys, and he's not really getting credit.
Trending to be a legend. And
Yeah,
it's kind of, he, for some reason, a lot of his cards feel like showbox fights. Like, even though the Lubin fight was a fight that you and me marked, for some reason, it didn't get that same traction that these other fights get. You get what I'm saying? It didn't get that excitement that these other Showtime Championship boxing bouts get. But if he keeps being in these fights and keeps putting exciting performances together, we're going to wake up one day and go, oh, Fandora, really solid resume. One of the top three guys. When did this happen? So I think people are overlooking that he's legitimately one of the three best 154 pounders based on achievement. And we're going to see how much he can fill out an arena. And I think we're looking at a guy that's going to fight all the guys in his era. I think Fandora could fight Danny Garcia, Keith Thurman. He could fight Errol Spence. He could fight Boots. He could fight Virgil Ortiz.
like David Benavidez.
He could fight Benavidez. He could fight. He's a guy where you could look at the end of his career and say, this guy fought a lot of really good fighters in his era.
Yeah, and I think that he's another guy that his power is going to get crazier when he moves up. I mean, him at light heavyweight, I feel like he's just sleeping guys. Like the way you see Callum Smith move out to light heavyweight, and now his power has that different level. I feel like that's going to happen with Fundora being that tall.
He's a potential 6 to 7 division world champion if he's moved in a manner that I think Samson will move him, he's a guy that could just clean up belts because he's going to just move up weights and still have such big advantages. And I think that everyone wants to be a boxing expert and say, why doesn't he fight on the outside? Look, Paul Williams and Willie Nelson hit really hard and they fought on the inside. Temperament trumps what people think are your physical advantages.
But
Willie,
I think it's always going to be tough for people to get past that because it's so exaggerated how much bigger he is. But I think if he was at light heavyweight or cruiserweight, I think his style would be embraced a little bit more because those advantages would be less exaggerated.
and I think that that's what's exciting about him is as he moves up weight classes, I think his style is actually going to improve to a degree.
Yeah.
As long as he has durability, I think that people are going to go, "Oh, wow, he," because I think that he's a very, very skilled boxer, but because we're not used to seeing like a shooting guard in the NBA fight on the inside with a 5'9" guy, everyone's saying like, why aren't you Tommy Hearns? Why aren't you just turning over a jab and throwing a right hand? As you said, the exaggeration of him makes people assume that he's not a skilled fighter. And beyond that, I think that exaggeration also brings in interest because he's kind of almost like Butterbean. He's a talented Butterbean, but there's a level of, dude, I got to see the big tall guy.
Yeah. And I think like as opposed, like you said, I think his temperament is to fight on the inside. So I think as opposed to expecting that he's just going to all of a sudden keep everything real long, I think what's more realistic is I'd like to see his inside defense improve. I'd like to see his work on the inside be a little tighter and not be getting his head swiveled every fight. That's the improvement I want to see, not necessarily that he becomes, like a Vladimir Klitschko.
Yeah, it's tough, bro. It's real tough, It's Look, that's another thing. Young kid developing comes from a fighting family. I think the world of Freddie Fandora. He's got a sister who fights. There's a lot of upside. I'm curious to see how this card does. That being said, Carlos Ocampo, who's in his corner, Sean Gibbons. Sean's probably one of the best matchmakers that gets zero credit because he's not a matchmaker. He's a manager advisor, but he picks the right fights for his fighters. So I think the other thing is don't be shocked if Ocampo fights better than you think because Sean Gibbons just put Israel Gonzalez in with Bam Rodriguez, and that was a stylistically advantageous fight for his fighter as well.
Yeah, that was a great fight too, bro. I guess last thing I want to bring up is, he fought a couple of weeks ago, last week, whatever. What do you think is next for Shakur Stevenson? Where do you see his trajectory? Is he a guy that winds up at welterweight, junior middleweight? Does he
All time great. I don't know where he goes in terms of ceiling, but I mean, I think the two guys I'm looking at are Boots Ennis and Shakur Stevenson and Devin Haney. That kind of triangle of fighters. I think they're going to be carrying the sport forward. So those are the guys that I'm kind of looking at to carry the sport. I really think Tank is right up there with them, but his resume isn't, and he needs to take these type of fights to challenge himself. I get that he's making a lot of money, but we need some of those legacy fights to truly put him up there. I think that sadly Tank is getting slept on for how talented he is because we're not getting these type of fights where it's like the 1 and 2 guy in the division. And that's the thing. But I mean, I expect Shakur Stevenson at some point to be a pound for pound number one guy at some point. I don't know where his frame fills out because he's still, what is he, 24, 25, fairly young guy. He's going to be at lightweight for probably a little bit of a minute. He'll probably go to 40. He's getting to a point that's interesting in his career where I sense with Shakur and Devin Haney, they're challenging themselves and they want big big goals. They're going after threats. So like it's pretty obvious Shakur is going to probably go after Lomachenko. And that's a absolutely awesome fight. Devin Haney's flying across the world to fight in Australia. Not a lot of young fighters would fight in Australia 2 times
Yep.
for a world title.
No,
It's underrated. These guys are going for the legacy component of the sport. They're not going just for the prize. So with Shakur Stevenson, what's exciting is he's gonna challenge himself to the maximum capacity. And we're in an era where there's not a lot of like we got Jermel Charlo. I think he truly is doing that. We got guys, we got a slew of guys where we're not seeing that. And I think the frustrating thing is I feel Terrence Crawford is one of those guys, and I feel Errol Spence is one of those guys. And I feel like it's the men in suits that are stopping that fight more so than the fighters. Because when you listen to the fighters talk, I don't really hear them saying anything but let's fight, which tells me it's the guys in the suits that are probably slowing down that action.
Yeah. Well, it's a fucking shame that that's probably often the case, unfortunately. Um, Big dog, is there anything, anyone, anywhere that you want to shout out before we wrap this one up?
I mean, just if you like my personality, please buy the book. It's on Amazon, Inside the Ropes of Boxing. If you type in Lucas, you don't have to spell my last name. It should come up. My grandma read it in front of me in like an hour yesterday. She really liked it. Um, I bought a lot of copies. There's giveaways. I'll probably have Dakota do a giveaway at some point, get him some books. YSM Media from Philly's going to be doing a giveaway. Um, in the ring with Christine's going to be doing a giveaway. Marquise Johns, NY Fights is going to do a giveaway. We're doing giveaways to give the book away. I believe in the book. I think it's a good book. Uh, People seem to like it. I go back and forth about if it's a good book because some days I'll just be like, man, did I say something that'll get me beat up or something? I'll battle depression. And then people will say, well, that was really needed. And so, I don't know. Life's just a journey. So if you want to support it, if you want to be positive, if you like me, I think it's worth reading. I wrote a book that I think that I wanted to read. So, you know.
Hey, listen, bro, I think it's a hell of an accomplishment. I thought it was great. There's nothing like it that I'm aware of, and I'm somebody that's inside of shit, and I'm always looking for shit like this, and I've never read
So
anything.
what did you think was most fascinating about it?
I just think that there's such a mystery around how boxing functions. And until you're in it to a certain extent, that's the only time you understand it. And I feel like my understanding of it is always expanding. And I think that this is one of the only instances where people where an author is kind of pulling back the curtain just a little bit and just making it accessible. Like, yo, this is I mean, if you talk to somebody who knows nothing about boxing at all, right? There's a good chance they don't know the difference between amateur and pro boxing. There's a chance that all of these different things that might be common sense in another sport, I think, are kind of mysterious to people that are outside of it. You know what I mean? So I think that's
Or
the part.
or like sparring, like if you're an amateur fighter who's fighting 3 rounds, why are you sparring 12 rounds with a world champion?
Right.
Like how does that benefit you? It benefits the world champion. I'm sure he's going 12 rounds. He's got a good young fighter. But like things like sparring should always be meeting in the middle. You shouldn't just be giving and you shouldn't just be receiving. You got to meet someone in the middle.
Well, it's a hell of an accomplishment, bro. I appreciate you coming on today, as always, and I'll see you, I'm sure, on ITR Boxing at some point soon.
Yeah, I mean, buy my book and now I got to go back to work. It was fun to be on your show. Really value you. I hope it's a good book. It's gotten good praise, but I'm sure at some points people will talk about how awful the book is or something. But um I wrote the book not to get rich, and I'm sure I'll lose money on the book because I'm buying the book for people and stuff. But I want to end on this. I'm the only thing that I can believe in, right? So like if I can't go all in on myself, what can I go all in on? Um, so that's why I'm doing it. My buddy compared it to, I guess that writer Anthony Bourdain did something with the food industry. I don't really understand the comparison because I've never read his books or I don't really care, but he compared it to that. But it's real nice. I wouldn't say I'm an insider, but I've just been around a lot of stuff and I just don't want young people, especially young poor people, to use a lot of their money and not really understand what they're using their money for. So I wanted to put this out there to kind of help people because boxing's not really the thing to just jump all in because there's always going to be different perspectives and different mindsets. And the sad part is most people mean well. They just only know what they know. And the level of poverty in boxing and the amount of money in the distribution, well, it's not the same as everything else. So you see the worst side of human nature in boxing a lot of times.
Yeah. Yeah, that's some real shit, bro. Well, we'll talk soon. I appreciate you, bro.